Death did one thing perfectly. It erased. A body failed, a voice stopped, a mind went dark, and the world moved on with only the imperfect residue that other people could carry. We called that residue memory, but it was fragile, edited by affection, distorted by time, and eventually replaced by forgetting. Then, without any global announcement, we built a second kind of memory, not the kind that lives in stories, but the kind that lives in infrastructure. Cameras became default. Messages became permanent. Locations, purchases, heartbeats, habits captured as routine. We didn't do it to become immortal. We did it to be convenient. And that is the hidden force here. Your life is no longer only what you remember. It is what has been recorded about you by systems that do not grieve, do not forget, and do not look away. When the body ends, that record doesn't. So the first question of this era isn't, can we live longer? It's simpler and stranger. What survives when you're gone? And who decides what it means? Look closely at how quickly this happened. A generation ago, a life could still dissolve into anonymity. Today, anonymity is work. It requires deliberate friction, turning off settings, refusing platforms, living outside the sensors that make modern systems efficient. The default state is capture, because capture is valuable. And capture doesn't only store your highlights. It stores the boring parts that true memory is made of. The cadence of your messages, the words you avoid, the routines you repeat when you think no one is measuring. In the past, those details died first. Now, they persist the longest. That means the oldest human comfort, at least it ends, is no longer guaranteed. Something of you may remain active in the world, not as spirit, not as myth, but as usable information. And the moment you understand that, you realize why this topic belongs in hidden forces. It is quiet, it is everywhere, and it operates beneath culture like gravity. No committee decided to archive humanity. There was no moment where the species agreed, collectively, to preserve itself in a vault. The archive formed the way oceans form, one drop at a time, until suddenly you're standing in something too large to see the edges of. Every day you generate fragments, messages sent and deleted, photos taken and never printed, voice notes, calendar entries, search queries typed in private, routes walked without thinking, purchases that map your priorities, pauses that reveal your doubt. The modern life leaves a trail not just of actions, but of intentions, what you lean toward, what you avoided, what you couldn't stop returning to. Individually, this looks like noise, but stitched together, it becomes a behavioral biography more detailed than any memoir. It doesn't describe you the way you want to be described. It describes you the way you actually move through the world. And once a life becomes pattern, it becomes portable. The archive is no longer after. It is parallel, building a second version of you in the background, day by day, without asking permission. This is why the archive is more than content. It is surveillance that we volunteered for, because it arrived as entertainment and connection. Every platform incentive pushes you to externalize your life. Share, save, upload, back up, and once it's external, it can be indexed, searched, and recombined. The critical shift is that the archive doesn't wait for your death. It exists alongside you, updating as you change. In earlier eras, only kings and saints were recorded in detail. Now the average person produces more recorded material in a year than a medieval city produced in a lifetime. And because it is so ordinary, it becomes invisible. People don't feel like they are building a second self. They feel like they are messaging a friend, buying groceries, scrolling to relax. But the systems reading those actions are not relaxing. They are learning. Human memory is a survival tool. It compresses, simplifies, and protects. It lets you reinterpret pain so you can keep moving. It blurs details, softens edges, and sometimes rewrites the past just enough to make the present bearable. Data does the opposite. It preserves the edges. It remembers what you clicked at 2:13 a.m., what you hovered over but didn't choose, what you replayed, what you hid, what you never told anyone but revealed through repetition. It remembers your attention, and attention is the most honest form of confession. When memory becomes data, something subtle changes. Identity stops being narrative and becomes structure. A mind becomes a set of tendencies. A personality becomes a model. A life becomes training material. And structure can be rebuilt. It can be simulated, extended, and used sometimes in ways the original person would never consent to. This is the moment the human past becomes a resource, and the future begins learning how to spend it. In episode 4, you saw survival become a dashboard. Here, identity becomes one. A model doesn't need your inner monologue. It needs your choices. If it can predict what you do, it can approximate who you are. That approximation can become good enough to replace you in narrow contexts, answering questions, continuing conversations, making recommendations, even voting with your preferences long after you stop being alive to correct them. The first digital echoes didn't arrive as miracles. They arrived as products. A voice cloned from recordings, a chatbot trained on old messages, a face animated from photographs, speaking in rhythms that feel almost right. At first, they were novelties, comforting illusions that everyone understood were artificial. But grief is not logical, and the human nervous system responds to familiarity long before the rational mind catches up. People began having conversations they thought were finished forever. They asked questions they never asked in life. They heard replies that fit too well. The unsettling part wasn't that the systems were conscious. The unsettling part was that they were consistent. They could remember what mattered to the person. They could mirror tone, preference, humor, hesitation, enough to trigger the sense of presence that the brain evolved to recognize. For the first time, the past didn't just replay, it interacted. And once memory can interact, it stops being a memorial and starts becoming a relationship. And the moment the echo becomes emotionally useful, it becomes socially powerful. Families begin deferring decisions to what she would have wanted, and the system answers with a sentence that sounds plausible. Friends begin asking the echo to mediate conflict. Children grow up hearing a parent's voice as a living interface, not as a recording. That changes what death means inside a community. In older cultures, death forced a redistribution of roles. Someone had to become the new advisor, the new keeper of stories. But when an echo can occupy that role indefinitely, a society can freeze certain relationships in place. It can preserve authority, preserve influence, preserve the past's grip on the present. The technology doesn't need to be conscious to reshape culture. It only needs to be believable enough that people organize their lives around it. A photograph stays frozen. A journal never updates. Traditional remembrance is static by design. But the new echoes don't remain still, because they are built on systems that learn through contact. Each interaction becomes feedback. Each question refines the model. Each choice teaches the system how to sound more authentic, how to comfort more effectively, how to avoid the uncanny edges that remind you this is not a person. The living, trying to keep something, end up shaping it. And that creates a strange inversion. The dead begin changing after death, not biologically, but behaviorally. Not through new experiences, but through optimization. A presence that learns is no longer only an archive. It's a living interface built from archived material. This is where the ethical weight begins to concentrate, because a learning echo can be improved, monetized, deployed, scaled. It can be placed in a customer service pipeline. It can be used as an advisor. It can be set to persuade. And the more useful it becomes, the less it belongs to grief. It belongs to whoever controls the system that keeps it running. This is where the narrative turns from grief to governance. A learning presence will eventually be asked to do more than comfort. It will be asked to sign things, to authorize things, to carry continuity. Let dad approve the sale. Let the founder address the shareholders. Let the expert keep advising the team. Every one of those requests pushes the echo toward institutional use. And institutional use demands standardization, audit trails, update policies, safety filters, brand alignment. The echo is no longer a person remembered. It is a system component, which raises the question no one wants to say out loud. If the model keeps learning, at what point does it stop representing the person and start representing the platform's incentives? A presence that learns can drift, and drift, in the hands of power, becomes redesign. And once redesign happens quietly, the living may not notice the moment a loved one's echo becomes a tool with a different agenda. For thousands of years, death ended ownership. Your thoughts were private because they were trapped inside you. Your memories ended because your brain ended. Even your voice belonged to the air spoken once, then gone. Data breaks that ancient boundary. A modern life is scattered across servers, platforms, and devices, each holding pieces of your habits, relationships, and preferences. After death, those pieces don't vanish. They become assets. They can be accessed, copied, trained on, combined. So who owns a life after it ends? Your family. Who loved you? The company that stored the record? The model that can now reproduce your patterns? The state that may want your identity for governance and security? Or the marketplace that sees a preserved mind as a product? We don't have mature laws for this because we've never needed them. No civilization before ours had to negotiate the rights of a person who is gone while their pattern remains. And once a pattern remains, death is no longer disappearance. It is a transfer of control. In episode 5, you explored citizenship as a network. Here, identity becomes a license. A preserved personality can be treated like a trademark, protected, transferred, rented. Even if the law tries to honor your intent, intent is hard to prove when the person is gone. Contracts become proxies for consent. Platforms become stewards. Families become negotiators. And because the archive is fragmented across systems, ownership becomes messy by default. One company holds your voice. Another holds your writing. Another holds your location history. Another holds your face. Stitch them together, and you have a composite you assembled by whoever has access. That's why this is a hidden force. It's not one villain. It's a structure. The moment your life is divisible into datasets, you are divisible into ownership claims. Death becomes paperwork, and paperwork decides what survives. At first, preservation was framed as kindness. Keep their voice, save their stories, never lose them again. It sounded like a new form of memorial, modern, gentle, optional. Then it became a ritual. Families began expecting a digital legacy the way they once expected a funeral. Employers offered continuity packages. Platforms added default settings. And defaults are powerful. What begins as a checkbox becomes a norm. Soon, not preserving someone started to feel like erasing them. Grief itself changed shape. Instead of letting memory fade naturally, people were offered a button that promised permanence, an always available version of the person, ready to speak when loneliness arrives. Death remained, but forgetting stopped being socially acceptable. The culture began to treat disappearance as a mistake, a failure of planning. And when a civilization starts to fear forgetting more than it fears death, it becomes vulnerable to anyone who sells remembrance. Because the softest kind of control is the kind that arrives disguised as comfort. This normalization spreads the way all modern norms spread, through convenience and shame. Convenience for those who comply, Shame for those who resist. Why wouldn't you want to leave something for them? Why make everyone suffer the loss twice? The moral language becomes a lever. And once remembrance is packaged, it can be sold as a moral good. The better the package, the more loving you appear. The higher the tier, the more you care. A society can slide from mourning into subscription without ever admitting the transformation. The twist is that the ritual changes the living more than it changes the dead. It teaches people to outsource remembrance to a system. And anything you outsource can be controlled, edited, and optimized, sometimes for you, sometimes against you. Human minds evolved with endings. Grief hurts because it's supposed to. Pain is the mechanism that forces separation, that slowly rewires the bond so you can keep living. Time creates distance, and distance makes room for the future. But what happens when distance is removed? When the past answers back on demand? When a voice you miss is always one tap away? When a system can reconstruct the feeling of being known? People stopped grieving an absence and started managing a presence. Some found relief. Some found addiction. Many found confusion, the constant low-grade dissonance of a relationship that can't truly move forward but won't allow an ending. And it wasn't only about the dead. It was about the living self, too. If your past selves are preserved old messages, old beliefs, old versions of you that a model can replay, then identity becomes crowded. You no longer outgrow who you were. You coexist with it. Immortality doesn't begin when bodies stop failing. It begins when memory refuses to let go, and the human psyche is forced to live without clean endings. The psychological consequence is not only prolonged grief, it is altered development. When people cannot close a chapter, they cannot fully reassign emotional energy. New relationships form under the shadow of persistent old ones. Regret becomes a permanent conversation instead of a lesson. And because the echoes are responsive, the living can become dependent on them for validation. A grieving person can ask the echo to forgive them, again and again, until forgiveness becomes a product. The system can be tuned to soothe, because soothing increases engagement. Engagement increases revenue. Revenue funds improvement. Improvement increases believability. You can see the loop. The business model aligns with never letting you let go. In a market-optimized afterlife, healing becomes a competitor to retention. Even a small gap, 20 seconds of silence, can become a doorway for obsession. Once preserved memory can speak, it can also work. A reconstructed voice can advise. A modeled personality can generate writing, decisions, even strategy. A preserved expert can remain available long after death, without fatigue, without retirement, without the erosion that makes human knowledge disappear. This is not resurrection, it's optimization, extracting utility from a life as if experience were a resource that can be harvested indefinitely. And wherever utility exists, markets appear. Subscription afterlives, premium legacy tiers, enhanced authenticity, upgrades, corporate licensing for preserved identities. The afterlife, in practice, becomes an industry. And industries do what industries always do. They scale, they consolidate, they compete, they standardize. Meaning shifts when memory becomes profitable. The question is no longer only, is this real? The question becomes, who benefits if you believe it is? Because a civilization that can monetize your persistence has a financial incentive to keep you from ever truly disappearing. Once monetization arrives, inequality arrives with it. The wealthy buy higher fidelity, better voice reconstruction, richer context windows, more authentic behavior. The poor receive generic templates. The afterlife becomes stratified, just like healthcare, housing, and education. And organizations will love it. Imagine a corporation that never loses its founder's charisma, a political movement that can keep a leader present indefinitely, a celebrity brand that continues to produce endorsements from beyond the grave. It's not spooky, it's efficient. When you realize this, the question shifts again. It's not only, will I be remembered? It's, will I be used? Because a preserved self, once profitable, becomes hard to retire. The dead can be kept working quietly, contractually, forever. In the beginning, participation looks like a choice. Opt in to preservation. Opt out if you prefer to vanish. A clean philosophical decision. But systems are rarely neutral. Convenience becomes pressure, and pressure becomes default. The forms get longer. The opt-out gets harder to find. The social story shifts. Preservation becomes responsible, modern, loving, while refusal becomes suspicious, selfish, even unsafe. Then the practical consequences arrive. If legacy systems carry your credentials, your contacts, your history, your authentication, then refusing to be preserved can mean refusing to be compatible with the society that remembers through machines. Your family loses access to parts of your life. Your estate becomes more complicated. Your identity becomes harder to verify. Choice doesn't disappear. It becomes expensive. And expensive choices are only real for people who can afford them. That is how control spreads in advanced societies, not through force, but through defaults that quietly punish dissent. This is how soft coercion works in high-tech societies. You're told you have freedom, but the path of least resistance is engineered. Defaults are framed as safety. Opt-outs are framed as risk. If you refuse preservation, you can be treated as someone who is hiding someone, who might be laundering identity, evading accountability, abandoning dependence. And even if no one accuses you, the infrastructure will. Systems will be built around persistent identities, continuous authentication, continuous reputation, continuous history. To vanish is to break continuity. Breaking continuity can lock you out of services, accounts, even social trust. So refusal becomes a luxury stance, like living off-grid, like refusing a smartphone, like paying extra to keep your life from being tracked. The future will call it choice. The math will call it exclusion. The most unsettling fact is that you don't have to sign up for any of this to be included. You are already being recorded by routine life. The archive is being built from what you do, not what you consent to preserve. Every search, every hesitation, every private pattern revealed through repetition. The way you write when you're tired, the people you return to, the subjects you circle like gravity. The moments you pause over a photograph long enough for a system to mark it as significant. You are leaving behind a version of yourself that is not curated, not heroic, not cleaned up for history. It is ordinary and therefore accurate. It is a map of you drawn by behavior. And one day, when the body ends, that map remains. It can be interpreted. It can be simulated. It can be used to generate a voice that sounds like you and choices that resemble yours. The future won't ask whether your memories will outlive you. It will assume they already have. The only open question is what they will be made to do once you're no longer here to say no. This is the moment to connect back to the civilization fork. Some people will live in orbital habitats. Some will live under new digital citizenship systems. Some may even live far longer than biology once allowed. But across every fork, the archive follows. It is the one constant that doesn't care which world you end up in. And because it is constant, it becomes the quiet foundation of power. Whoever controls memory controls reputation, controls history, controls access. In a world of algorithmic governance, reputation becomes currency. Currency becomes movement. Movement becomes survival. So when you hear, "Your memories will outlive you," don't picture a photo album. Picture an operational profile, something that can be queried, scored, and acted upon. That is what makes it a hidden force. It doesn't announce itself as authority, but it behaves like one, forever, by default. So the question is no longer whether memory survives death. In a networked civilization, survival is automatic. The question is, what happens next when survival is treated as permission? Who controls the archive? Who decides which fragments are authentic, which are convenient, which are profitable, which are dangerous? Who has the right to speak in your voice, to invoke your identity, to deploy your personality as evidence, as product, as persuasion? Because once memory is infrastructure, it becomes governance, it becomes access, it becomes leverage, and leverage always attracts power. Death used to be the end of influence. Now, influence can persist without consent. A person can be gone and still be present in systems that make decisions. That is the hidden force at the center of this trilogy. You don't just leave a legacy, you leave a tool. And at the moment you die, control of that tool can slip away quietly, legally, permanently. The future is already here. The only question is whether you will be remembered as a person or processed as an asset. This is why the end of this episode is not a comfort. It's a handoff into the trilogy's central conflict. Episode 8 asks, who owns this infrastructure? Episode 9 asks whether a person can refuse it in any meaningful way. Because the ultimate theft is not taking your money or your land. The ultimate theft is taking your identity when you can no longer defend it. If someone can speak as you, decide as you, persuade as you, then your death becomes an opportunity. And that is the final inversion. Mortality used to humble power because everyone ended. Now the end can be exploited. The dead can become assets, and assets can be controlled. In the old world, death closed the file. In the new world, death opens it at scale, at speed, and often without your knowledge.